Tonight, a story that never happened. It begins on a morning that did, the 15th of March, in the year 44 before our era, in the city of Rome, a little before dawn. And for a while we will walk through that morning exactly as it occurred, step by step, because the thing we are here to imagine only makes sense if we first stand in the real one and feel how narrow the gap was between what happened and what almost did. The night had not gone well in the house of the dictator. His wife, Calpurnia, had slept badly, and near morning she woke from a dream so vivid and so terrible that she could not shake it. The ancient writers describe it in different ways, that she dreamed the gable of the house, a special honor the Senate had granted them, came crashing down, that she held her murdered husband in her arms and wept. However the dream took its shape, its meaning was the same, and it frightened her enough that she did something she had never done before. She begged him not to go. And Caesar, that morning, was inclined to listen. He was 55 years old, and he had not been sleeping well either, and he was unwell, the sources hint at dizziness, at the falling sickness that had troubled him for years. He had been feeling it. And so, for a while, on that real morning, the most powerful man in the world sat in his house and considered simply staying home. He decided he would send word to the Senate that he would not come today. And then a man arrived. His name was Decimus Brutus, not the famous Brutus, but another one, a man Caesar trusted completely, a man who had fought under him and been rewarded by him and named in his will, and who was also, though Caesar did not know it, one of the conspirators. And Decimus talked him out of it. He teased him gently for listening to a woman's dreams. He reminded him that the Senate was full, waiting, ready to vote him honors. He took him by the hand, and Caesar got up and went. That is the true morning. That is the hinge on which the world actually turned. Hold it there for a moment, the dictator on his feet, his wife's fear still in the room, the trusted friend at the door with his hand out. Everything that followed, the whole shape of the world for centuries, ran through that small quiet moment in a house before dawn. And it went the way it went because a frightened man was persuaded to ignore the one person who was right. But tonight, he isn't. Tonight, in the story we are going to tell, something in him holds. Perhaps the dizziness swells as he stands. Perhaps he looks at Calpurnia's face, and something older than politics stops him. Perhaps Decimus, reaching for his hand, is a heartbeat too slow. It does not matter which. What matters is that on this telling, the dictator sits back down and sends Decimus away with a message. That Caesar is unwell today, and the Senate will meet without him, and the business of Rome will wait. And in the hall where 60 men are waiting with daggers hidden in their robes, the daggers are never drawn. The floor stays clean, and a different world, one that never got to exist, begins quietly to unfold. Let us pause here at the threshold before we follow the road that opens. There is a version of this hall that history remembers, the benches slick with blood, the dictator fallen at the base of a statue, 60 men and their knives, a republic tearing itself open in a single hour. We know that room. We have always known it. But there is another room, and it is the one we are standing in now. It is quiet. The senators are restless, waiting for a man who will not come. The statue of Pompey looks down on an empty floor. No one has moved. No one has reached inside his robe. In a little while the session will be abandoned, and the men who came to kill will file out into the March morning with their weapons still hidden and their moment gone. And they will have to decide, each of them, what to do with a plot that has suddenly failed, and with a dictator who is still alive, and who may yet learn their names. Keep that clean and silent floor somewhere in your mind as we go. We will come back to it. It is the still point this whole story turns around, the killing that did not happen, and the long, strange peace and war that flowed out of its absence. Because here is the thing that makes this particular morning so extraordinary, a place to change history. Caesar was not planning to stay in Rome at all. He was leaving in 3 days. On the 18th of March, 44 before our era, 72 hours after the daggers, Caesar was scheduled to depart the city at the head of an army and march east to the greatest military undertaking of his entire life. This is not speculation. The sources are clear and they agree. The expedition was prepared, the legions were gathering, the date was set. 16 legions and 10,000 cavalry by the ancient count, the largest force he had ever assembled, larger than the army with which he had conquered Gaul, larger than the one he had turned against Rome itself. And its target was Parthia. To understand why that word carried such weight, you have to understand the wound it named. 11 years earlier, in 53 before our era, a Roman army had marched into the Parthian East under the command of Crassus, the richest man in Rome, the third member alongside Caesar and Pompey of the alliance that had carved up the republic between them. Crassus wanted military glory to match his wealth, and he went to Parthia to find it, and at a place called Carrhae, in the baking flatlands of what is now the border of Syria and Turkey, he found catastrophe instead. The Parthians were horsemen. They did not fight the way Rome's enemies were supposed to fight. Their horse archers circled the Roman squares at a distance and poured arrows into them hour after hour. And every time the legions thought the enemy must be running out of arrows, fresh supplies came up on camels, and the arrows kept falling. And their heavy cavalry, armored head to foot, man and horse alike, waited for the legions to break formation and then rode them down. The Romans had no answer. 20,000 of them died in the sand. 10,000 more were taken prisoner and marched off into the east, never to return. Crassus himself was killed during a parley, and the story that spread through the Roman world afterward, whether or not it was true, was that the Parthians, mocking his famous greed, poured molten gold down his throat. Carrhae was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, and more than that, it was an insult that had never been answered. The captured legionary eagles, the sacred standards of the legions, whose loss was a wound to the honor of the whole state, were in Parthian hands. For 11 years they had stayed there, and Caesar, at the height of his power, having beaten every other enemy Rome had, having beaten Rome itself, was going east to get them back, and to do to Parthia what Alexander had once done to Persia, to break it open and conquer it and stand at the edge of the world. That was the plan the daggers interrupted. And so the very first question our quiet Senate floor forces us to ask is the largest one of all. If Caesar had lived and marched as he intended to 3 days later, would he have won? The honest answer is that we do not know, and any historian who tells you otherwise is selling certainty that the evidence cannot support. But we can weigh it carefully, the way you might turn a heavy stone over in your hands in the dark, feeling for its balance. Begin with the case for Caesar. He was, by a wide margin, the finest general Rome ever produced, and arguably one of the finest the ancient world ever produced. He had a gift that Crassus entirely lacked, not merely for battle, but for the whole vast apparatus of war. Supply, movement, timing, the reading of ground and of men. Crassus had marched into Parthia arrogantly, without proper reconnaissance, allowing himself to be lured by a treacherous guide out into open desert where the horse archers held every advantage. Caesar did not make those kinds of mistakes. In Gaul, he had shown again and again that he could adapt to enemies who fought in unfamiliar ways, that he could learn a new kind of war in the middle of fighting it. And he had prepared this campaign with unusual care. The sources suggest he intended to approach not through the open desert that had killed Crassus, but through the north, through Armenia, hill country, broken ground, terrain that would blunt the great Parthian advantage of cavalry, and give his legions the close, grinding fight they were built to win. He also had time and numbers and the whole wealth of the Roman world behind him, and no rival left alive to undercut him. Whatever else you might say about the campaign, it was not going to fail for lack of resources or lack of will. And now the case against. Parthia had beaten Rome before, and not by accident. The Parthian system of war was genuinely, structurally difficult for a legion-based army to defeat, and it would remain so for centuries. After Caesar, Rome would try again and again to conquer Parthia and its successor. Antony would try, within 15 years, with a huge army and Caesar's own plans, and would suffer a miserable, grinding failure and a terrible retreat. Later emperors would march east and take the Parthian capital and burn it, and still never hold the land. They would win the battles and lose the country, because the Parthian heartland was vast and dry and swallowed armies. Rome could reach Parthia. Rome could hurt Parthia. Rome could never quite keep Parthia. There is a real possibility that Caesar, for all his genius, would have discovered what every Roman commander after him discovered, that the East was a place where Roman armies went to exhaust themselves against distance and heat, and an enemy that would not stand and fight the way Rome needed it to. And there is the harder truth underneath, the one that has nothing to do with tactics. Caesar was 55, and he was not well. The campaign was expected to take 3 years. A man of that age, with his health already failing, marching into the most physically punishing theater of war in the known world for 3 years. The arithmetic is not kind. It is entirely possible that the thing which would have stopped Caesar in Parthia was not a Parthian arrow at all, but his own body, somewhere on a road in Armenia, far from home. So we are left holding a stone that will not settle. The likeliest outcome, if we are honest, is not the clean triumph the legend would want, nor a second carry, but something in between and less satisfying: early victories, the recovery of the lost eagles perhaps, a battle or two won, a great deal of Roman prestige restored, and then the slow, grinding realization that the country could not actually be held, and a return or a death on the road, with the thing left unfinished. Alexander's ghost was a hard master, and it had ruined better rested men than Caesar. But let us, for the sake of the story, grant him the thing he wanted most, not the whole conquest, which almost no one could have achieved, but the vindication. Let us say he goes east, and fights well, and takes back the eagles that were lost at Carrhae, and breaks a Parthian army in the field, and stands for one bright season as the man who avenged Crassus and outmarched Alexander. Let us say he comes home 3 years later, in the year 41 before our era, in triumph, the greatest Roman who ever lived, to a city that has spent those 3 years waiting for him. Because it is what waits for him in Rome, far more than what waits in Parthia, that truly decides the fate of the world. While Caesar is in the east, Rome sits with a problem that his survival has not solved, but only postponed. And it is worth understanding this clearly, because it is the heart of the whole matter. The daggers on the Ides were not really about the past. They were about the future. And the future had a shape that frightened people, and Caesar's being alive did not change that shape. It only delayed the moment when Rome would have to confront it. The problem was this: Caesar had made himself dictator for life, not for 6 months, the old emergency term the Republic had always used, not for a year. For life, dictator perpetuo, the words newly struck onto the coins, his face on one side and that impossible permanent title on the other. And a permanent dictator is a king in everything but name. And Rome had spent 450 years defining itself, at the very root of its identity, against the idea of kings. The city had expelled its last king centuries before, and built its whole political religion on the vow that it would never have another. That vow was the thing the senators believed they were defending with their knives, and it was still there to be defended, whether Caesar lived or died. So even in our story, where he lives, the question does not go away, it simply waits. What happens when a dictator for life reaches the end of that life? A kingship once established passes to an heir. But Rome had no machinery for that, no law of succession, no accepted way to hand supreme power from one man to the next, because supreme power held by one man was precisely the thing the whole system existed to prevent. Caesar had built a position that only he could occupy, and he was mortal, and everyone knew it. He had the falling sickness. He was 55. He was about to march into Parthia for 3 years. The question of what came after him was not academic. It was pressing, and it was unanswered, and it would have to be answered whether or not he was murdered in a Senate hall. And when we look at the people who might have answered it, we begin to see how little the assassination truly settled. Consider first the young man Caesar himself had chosen, though almost no one knew it yet, because the choice was hidden inside a will that had not been read. His name was Gaius Octavius. He was 18 years old. He was Caesar's grandnephew, the grandson of Caesar's sister, a thin, often sickly young man with no great military record and no political standing, who in the spring of 44 was across the Adriatic in a town on the coast of Illyria, waiting, pointedly, to accompany his great uncle on the Parthian march. He had been sent ahead to study, and to train, and to be near the campaign. He was, in every visible respect, a minor figure. And Caesar's will, when it was opened after the real assassination, revealed that this obscure teenager had been named the primary heir, not merely to Caesar's enormous fortune, but through a posthumous act of adoption to his name. In our story, the will is not opened because Caesar does not die, and so the world never learns, in the spring of 44, what Caesar intended. Octavian remains what he appears to be, a promising boy of no particular consequence, waiting across the sea. But we, looking down from above, know what history did with that boy. We know that in the real timeline, handed nothing but a dead man's name and a contested inheritance, he clawed his way through 13 years of civil war, outmaneuvered every rival, defeated Antony and Cleopatra, and became Augustus, the first Roman emperor, the man who ended the Republic for good and ruled the Mediterranean world for more than 40 years, and who turned out to be one of the most gifted political minds in all of history. And here is the strange, vertiginous thing our quiet Senate floor does to that story. If Caesar lives, Octavian never becomes Augustus, at least not in the way he did. The very thing that made him was his great-uncle's murder. It was the assassination that handed him a name to conjure with, an army of Caesar's veterans hungry for revenge, and a cause. Take away the daggers, and you take away the making of Augustus. The boy is still there, still brilliant, still waiting across the sea. But the furnace that forged him has gone cold. He becomes, instead, what Caesar probably intended him to be all along, an heir in slow training, a lieutenant, a nephew being groomed across years and campaigns for a succession that might come in 10 years or 20 or never cleanly at all. Which means that the assassination did not prevent the rise of Augustus. It caused it. This is the first of the deep ironies we will find on this road, and not the last. Return for a moment to the empty floor. The senators have gone home. The session was abandoned. The dictator was unwell. There was nothing to be done but disperse and wait for another day. And out in the city, the 60 men who came to kill are scattered now among their houses, and each of them is sitting with the same cold thought. It did not happen, and he is alive, and he is the most dangerous man in the world, and he keeps a list. We will come to what they do, but hold the stillness first. Notice that the thing which did not happen has already begun to ripple, that a boy across the sea has just, without knowing it, lost the empire he was going to build, and gained instead a quieter and longer road whose ending no one can see. That is what the clean floor does. It does not stop the future. It swaps one future for another, silently, and the substitution is so complete that no one living will ever know a trade was made. There was, of course, another heir, a real son, of Caesar's own blood, which Octavian was not, and his existence complicates everything, and it is one of the richest threads in the whole tapestry, so let us follow it gently. His name was Ptolemy Caesar, called by the people of Egypt Caesarion, Little Caesar. He was the son of Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt, and he had been born in 47 before our era, which made him 3 years old in the spring of the Ides. Cleopatra claimed, loudly and consistently, that Caesar was the father, and the boy's very name was a political weapon aimed at making that claim impossible to ignore. And here is a detail that tells you how tangled the situation was. At the moment of the real assassination, Cleopatra was not in Egypt. She was in Rome. Caesar had installed her in a villa across the river with her son, and she was living there, a foreign queen with a boy she called Caesar's child, in the middle of the Roman world, in open defiance of every Roman sensibility about kings and Eastern monarchs and the proper place of women. Under Roman law, Caesarion was nothing. He was illegitimate. He was half foreign. He was the child of a foreign queen, which to Roman ears was very nearly the worst thing a child could be. Caesar never publicly acknowledged him as his heir, and the will named Octavian, not the boy in the villa across the river. So in the strict legal sense, Caesarion was not a successor at all. But law is one thing, and a living son of Caesar's blood is another, and in a world where Caesar had lived, that son would have grown up, and grown into a question that Rome would eventually have had to answer. Imagine him at 15, at 20, the acknowledged or half-acknowledged son of the master of the world, raised partly in Rome, partly in Alexandria, fluent in the politics of both. Imagine the pull between his mother's dynasty, the oldest and richest monarchy in the Mediterranean, with 1,000 years of pharaonic legitimacy behind it, and his father's unprecedented power in the West. The union of Caesar's authority with the wealth and antiquity of Egypt was exactly the nightmare that Roman traditionalists most feared, the thing they suspected Caesar of secretly wanting. A Mediterranean monarchy, ruled from somewhere that was not quite Rome, blending the Roman and the Eastern in a way that would dissolve the Republic entirely into something older and more absolute. Cleopatra certainly wanted it. She was one of the most capable rulers of the age, and she had staked everything on her connection to Caesar, and she was playing a long game whose goal was a dynasty. In the real timeline, when Caesar died, she read the situation with brutal clarity, gathered her son, and sailed home to Egypt to wait and see who won, and then attached herself to the next Roman strongman, Antony, and tried to build the same dynasty with him instead, and very nearly succeeded before it all came apart at Actium. But in our story, she does not have to flee because her protector is not dead. She stays, or she comes, and goes between Rome and Alexandria as the most important foreign ally of the most powerful man alive, and her son grows up inside the light of Caesar's power. And whether Caesar ever intended it or not, the mere existence of that boy, growing, would have bent Roman politics around itself for a generation. The succession, which the assassination appeared to blow open, was in truth blown open either way. There were simply too many possible heirs, and no lawful way to choose among them. Octavian with the name, Caesarion with the blood, and the whole Roman aristocracy watching, certain of only one thing, that whatever came next, it must not be a king. We have left 60 men scattered across the city with a failed plot and a living dictator, and we must decide what becomes of them, because their fate is the fate of the old republic itself. The two names history remembers are Brutus and Cassius. Marcus Junius Brutus was the idealist, a man of genuine philosophical conviction descended, or so he believed, from the very Brutus who had expelled Rome's last king 5 centuries before, a lineage that placed on him an almost unbearable weight of expectation to act against tyranny. Caesar was fond of him, had spared him after he fought on the opposing side in the civil war, had promoted him and favored him, and there is an old and probably false tradition that Brutus may even have been more to Caesar than a friend. Cassius was the harder man, the practical one, the soldier who had actually held the Parthian frontier together after Carrhae when everyone else fell apart, and who hated Caesar not out of philosophy, but out of something more personal and more corrosive, the resentment of a proud man forced to owe everything to another's mercy. In the real timeline, having killed Caesar, these men discovered almost immediately that they had no plan for what came next. They had assumed that with the tyrant dead, the Republic would simply resume, that the Senate would thank them, and the old machinery would creak back into motion. Instead, they found a city that did not want them, a population loyal to Caesar's memory, and a surviving lieutenant, Antony, who outmaneuvered them within days. They fled east, raised armies, and were destroyed within 2 years. But in our story, they never strike, and so their reckoning takes a different and quieter form. A plot of 60 men cannot stay secret forever, and Caesar, alive and about to leave for 3 years, cannot march east leaving assassins at his back. He would have learned. Perhaps a conspirator's nerve breaks, and he informs, hoping for mercy. Perhaps Caesar's agents piece it together. Perhaps it simply leaks, as such things do. And then Caesar faces the choice that defined him. The old Caesar, the one of the Civil War, had made a deliberate and famous policy of clemency. He pardoned his enemies again and again and made a virtue of it, and it was one of the reasons he was loved. But clemency toward men who had plotted his murder is a different matter, and here the story could go 2 ways, and both tell us something. On one telling, Caesar is merciful even now, exiles the ringleaders rather than executing them, makes a great public show of magnanimity, and turns the failed plot into a propaganda triumph that only deepens his hold on the people. On another, colder telling, the falling out with mercy that the dictatorship had already begun is completed, and Caesar, hardening as absolute rulers harden, has them quietly killed, and something in him and in Rome crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. The dictator who kills senators for plotting against him is no longer even pretending to be the first man of a republic. He is a monarch defending a throne. Either way, the conspiracy as a political force is finished, and with it, the last organized attempt to restore the old order by violence. The men who might have been the Republic's defenders are dead or scattered or broken, and the Republic has lost its last set of teeth, not in a glorious hour on the Senate floor, but in the grinding, unglamorous aftermath of a plot that simply failed. And what of Antony? Marcus Antonius was Caesar's man, his most capable lieutenant, a superb soldier, a large and charismatic and appetite-driven man whom the sober disapproved of and the soldiers adored. In the spring of 44, he was consul, sharing the highest office with Caesar himself, and he was riding beside the dictator on the day of the Ides. In the real timeline, Caesar's death made Antony for a time the most powerful man in Rome, the heir apparent by default, until the boy with the name arrived from across the sea, and everything fractured into the long war that would eventually pit Antony and Cleopatra against Octavian and end at Actium. But in our story, Caesar lives, and so Antony never gets his moment at the top, and this is exactly as Caesar would have wanted it, because the evidence suggests Caesar valued Antony's abilities while distrusting his judgment. Antony remains what he was, the brilliant, unreliable right hand, useful in war, dangerous if left too near real power. He might command a wing of the Parthian army and win glory in the east. He might be left to manage Italy in Caesar's absence, a job at which the real Antony proved erratic. Cicero's letters, which pour venom on Antony at every opportunity, show us a man the traditional aristocracy regarded as a drunkard and a wastrel. And whether or not that was fair, it meant Antony could never be the vessel for the Republic's hopes. He was too much Caesar's creature. So he waits and serves and drinks, and the great confrontation between Antony and Octavian that tore the real world apart for a decade simply never happens, because the two young men who would have fought over Caesar's corpse are instead both standing in Caesar's shadow, alive, subordinate, and watching each other across the table of a man who will not die on schedule. Come back once more to the still floor, because the stillness is doing something now that it was not doing at the start. At first, the empty Senate was only an absence, a killing that failed to happen, a room where nothing occurred. But time has passed in our story, 3 years of it, and the absence has begun to fill with things. A boy across the sea who did not become an emperor, a queen in a villa who did not have to flee, conspirators broken quietly instead of dying gloriously, a right hand still waiting. The clean floor was never empty at all. It was pregnant, and what it has been carrying all this while is a different Rome, one whose shape we can now begin to see. Because in the years while Caesar was away in the east, the machinery he built kept running. And it is in that machinery, far more than in any battle, that his true legacy lies. We tend to remember Caesar for the drama, the crossing of the Rubicon, the affair with Cleopatra, the daggers. But in the last months of his life, he was engaged in something far less theatrical and far more consequential. He was rebuilding the Roman state from the foundations, at a pace and on a scale that no one had ever attempted, and much of it would outlast him no matter how he died. Consider the calendar. When Caesar came to power, the Roman year was a broken thing, a lunar calendar so far out of step with the seasons that the priests had to insert extra months to correct it. And because those priests were politicians, they inserted or omitted them for political advantage, so that the calendar had become a tool of corruption, and no one could say with confidence what day it truly was. The harvest festivals were falling in the wrong seasons. Caesar, with the help of astronomers from Alexandria, simply fixed it. He built a solar calendar of 365 days with a leap day every fourth year. And to force the old broken year back into alignment, he created a single year, the year before the Ides, that was 445 days long, the longest year in Roman history, remembered as the year of confusion. And the calendar he built is, with one small later adjustment, the calendar on your wall tonight. The month of his name, July, still carries it. That reform needed no successor, no dynasty, no victory in Parthia. It was already done, already working, and it would have worked whether he lived or died. Consider the colonies. Caesar was resettling tens of thousands of people, his discharged veterans who needed land, and the urban poor of Rome, who festered in the overcrowded city and made it ungovernable, sending them out to new and refounded colonies across the Mediterranean, to Carthage, which his enemy had destroyed and which he ordered rebuilt, to Corinth, to Spain and Gaul and North Africa. This was social engineering on a vast scale, draining the dangerous pressure from the capital and seeding the provinces with Roman citizens, and it did more to Romanize the Mediterranean than any conquest. Much of it was already in motion. Consider citizenship. Caesar was extending the Roman franchise outward, to the whole of Italy north of the old boundary, to communities in Spain and Gaul, to physicians and teachers in Rome itself. He was widening the definition of who could be Roman, loosening the grip of the old aristocracy on the identity of the state. And in doing so, he was beginning a process that would continue for centuries, until, eventually, nearly every free person in the empire was a Roman citizen. That, too, was a direction, not an event, and it would have continued to unfold. Consider even the small things that hint at the size of his mind. The sources tell us he was planning to drain the Pontine marshes near Rome and the Fucine Lake, to cut a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth, to build a great library to rival Alexandria's, to codify the whole sprawling chaos of Roman law into a single coherent system. Some of these were dreams that no one would achieve for centuries, but they show us what the survival of Caesar might really have meant, not simply more war, but the possibility that a mind of that scope, given 10 more years instead of none, might have remade the physical and legal fabric of the ancient world. This is the case for mourning the daggers. Not that Caesar was good. He was ruthless and vain, and had killed on a scale that beggars description, 1 million dead in Gaul by the ancient count, and 1 million more enslaved. But he was a builder as well as a destroyer, and the assassination cut him off in the middle of the building, and much of what he was making was left for others to finish or abandon. In our story, he finishes it. The calendar, the colonies, the citizenship, the law, all of it carried forward by the man who conceived it, over a decade of absolute power, until the Roman world is remade in a way that even the real Augustus, for all his 40 years, only partly accomplished. And yet, and here the story turns toward its harder truth, none of that building answers the one question that no reform could touch. What happens when the builder dies? Here is the question the whole night has been circling, and we can approach it now, slowly, in the quiet. The men who killed Caesar believed they were saving the Republic. That was the whole point, not personal hatred, though there was some of that, but the conviction that by removing one man they could restore the old system of shared power, of consuls and senate and annual offices, of a state where no single person stood above the law. They believed the Republic was a living thing that Caesar was strangling, and that if they cut his hand from its throat, it would breathe again. They were wrong, and the deepest thing our counterfactual reveals is just how wrong they were, because the Republic they were trying to save was already dead, and had been dead for a long time, and Caesar was not its murderer, but merely the man who finally stopped pretending otherwise. Consider what the Republic had already become before Caesar ever crossed the Rubicon. For 100 years, it had been tearing itself apart. Reformers had been murdered in the streets. Rival generals had marched their armies on Rome. One of them, Sulla, had made himself dictator a generation before Caesar and posted lists of citizens to be legally killed. Thousands of them, their property seized, their heads displayed in the Forum. The Republic had already produced civil war after civil war, each one more terrible than the last, because its institutions, designed for a small city-state, could no longer contain the ambitions of the men who commanded its now enormous armies and its now enormous wealth. The old system assumed that no individual could grow more powerful than the state, but conquest had made individuals who could. The Republic was a set of rules for a world that no longer existed, and everyone with eyes could see it, and had been able to see it for decades. Caesar did not break that system. He inherited its wreckage. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, deeper than any assassination, is that there was probably no way back. The armies were loyal to their generals, not to the state. The provinces were governed by men who behaved as kings. The population of the city depended for its bread on whoever controlled the grain. The machinery that had made the Republic work had already been hollowed out from within, and no act of will, no dagger, no noble speech could have restored it, because the conditions that had produced it were gone. Which means that in our story, where Caesar lives, the outcome is not the survival of the Republic. It is the same ending, reached by a smoother road. Caesar, alive, continues as dictator for life, and the office becomes normal simply by lasting. People grow used to it. A generation grows up knowing nothing else, and the unthinkable becomes the ordinary, which is how most great political changes actually happen, not by a sudden break, but by the slow death of the memory of anything different. And when Caesar finally does die, whether in Parthia or in his bed at 70, the question of succession is faced not in the chaos of assassination, but in the settled reality of an established autocracy, and someone inherits, because by then the habit of one-man rule is too deep to break. Perhaps it is Octavian, groomed and ready. Perhaps it is Caesarion, grown and formidable. Perhaps it is a general nobody has yet heard of. But someone inherits, and the Republic does not return, because it was never going to return, because it was already gone. The daggers, in other words, did not kill the Republic. The Republic was a corpse the conspirators mistook for a patient, and Caesar's survival would not have saved it. It would only have made its burial quieter. And so we arrive at the strange and unsettling place this road has been leading all along, and we can set it down gently, because it is the thought the whole night has been carrying toward you. The assassination of Julius Caesar was meant to destroy his power and restore the Republic. It accomplished the exact opposite of both. It destroyed the Republic and completed his power. Follow the chain one last time. Because Caesar was killed, his will was read, and an unknown boy inherited his name. Because the boy inherited that name, he inherited the loyalty of Caesar's veterans and the sympathy of a people enraged by the murder. Because he had that army and that cause, he could fight his way to the top over 13 years of civil war. Because those civil wars were so long and so exhausting and so terrible, the Roman people came at last to crave peace more than they craved liberty, and were willing, even grateful, to accept the rule of one man if only he would end the bloodshed. And so the boy became Augustus, and Augustus built the thing that Caesar had only gestured at. Not a dictatorship that everyone could see and resent, but an empire disguised as a restored republic, a monarchy that kept all the old republican forms as a comfortable costume, a system so cleverly constructed that it lasted, in one form or another, for 1500 years. Caesar wanted to be the founder of a new Roman order. He failed and was murdered for trying too openly, and his murder created the conditions under which his heir could succeed where he had failed, could found exactly that new order, more completely and more durably than Caesar himself ever could have, precisely because the horror of Caesar's death and the wars that followed had finally exhausted Rome's will to resist. If Caesar had lived, there might have been no Augustus, no clean founding, no 1500-year empire in the form we know. There might have been, instead, a long twilight, an aging dictator, a contested succession, more civil wars, a slower and messier slide into an autocracy that no one had the genius to design well. The empire that actually happened, the one that gave the world its longest peace and its roads, and its law and its language, may have needed the assassination to be born. The daggers that were meant to stop the empire may have been the very thing that made it. Caesar got the empire he wanted. He simply had to die to get it. So let us stand, one last time, on the floor that stayed clean. It is quiet there still. It was always quiet. The senators went home. The daggers went back into their sheaths unbloodied. And the man they came to kill lived on, to march east, perhaps to win, perhaps to die on a road in Armenia, perhaps to grow old as the uncrowned king of a world that had forgotten how to be anything else. We have followed that road a long way tonight, through Parthia and back, through the tangled inheritance of a boy with a name and a boy with the blood, through the reforms that remade a calendar and a citizenship and a law, all the way to the strange still center where the great irony sits, that the killing which did not happen in our story was the very thing the real world needed to become itself. And that is the quiet lesson of the road not taken. We imagine that history turns on its great violent moments, the dagger, the battle, the fall, but the counterfactual shows us something gentler and stranger, that the great forces were already in motion, that the Republic was already dying, that the Empire was already coming, and that the men with knives and the man they killed were all of them smaller than the tide they thought they were commanding. Change the morning of the Ides, and you do not change the sea. You only change the shape of one wave upon it. The floor stayed clean in our story. It made almost no difference in the end. The world became very nearly what it was going to become anyway, by a different and quieter road. And there is something restful in that thought, if you let it be. The sense that the currents beneath events are deep and slow and patient, that no single morning, however sharp, however bloody or bloodless, can truly turn them, that the great river of things goes on toward its sea regardless of which way any one man turns at any one door. So let it all grow soft now, and settle, and drift away into the dark. The house before dawn, and the frightened wife, and the friend at the door with his hand out, the empty Senate floor, and the statue of Pompey looking down on no one, the legions gathering in the east for a war that may or may not have come, a boy waiting across the sea for a future that traded itself, silently, for another, a queen in a villa by the river, and her small son, and the long game she played and lost, or won, in a world we can only guess at. None of it happened. All of it almost did. And the almost is a soft place to rest. A Rome that never was, laid quietly alongside the one that came to be, the two of them fading now into the same darkness, where the difference between what happened and what did not stops mattering at all, and there is only the long, slow current, carrying everything, asking nothing of you. You do not have to decide which world was real. You do not have to hold either of them. Let the daggers stay sheathed, and the floor stay clean, and the whole vast question sink down out of the light, into the still deep water underneath, where there are no empires and no assassinations, and no roads not taken, only rest. Let it go and sleep, and when the dark comes down again, I will be here to carry you off to another time long ago, and another story of what was or what might have been. Sleep well.